Hello, everyone. Welcome to VCLS, to this VCLS webinar. I'm Leonid Lavnevich. It's my pleasure to host and moderate this webinar for initiation of clinical trials in the United States. First of all, let me briefly introduce our speakers, Sandra Cottrell and Mark Gauthier. Sandra has more than 40 years of experience in leading FDA meetings and preparing submission documentation. She has an in-depth knowledge in regulatory science covering from pre-IND to post-approval. Mark has been engaged in regulatory science for 30 years in both industry and consulting areas. He has a proven experience in building and maintaining a good relationship with FDA personnel to facilitate the development and commercialization of new products. Next slide, please. So before presenting the objectives of this webinar, please note that this session will last approximately 1 hour with 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. During this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the chat. We'll address them in the end of this webinar. The replay will be available on our website after the live session. Before we dive deeper into the core subject, we would like to know more about our audience. So, are you familiar with the preparing and submitting an IND? So, if some of you are already familiar with presenting building IND dossier, I believe that this webinar will still brings you overview of the overall process and necessary steps leading to the initiation of your clinical trial in the United States. How to prepare your pre-IND meeting, what questions to ask, how to build your IND dossier, how to optimize your regulatory strategy, what are the timing considerations and recommendations. All these questions will be covered by our experts, Sandra and Mark. So I leave the stage to Sandra.
Thanks, Leonid. And everyone, thank you for joining Mark and myself on this 1 hour journey focused on enhancing your understanding of the US IND process, and which is summarized actually on this first slide from the pre-IND meeting all the way through initiating a US clinical trial. So let's begin with the next slide and talk about for a moment that the pre-IND meeting, which we'll be discussing in depth today, is really a two-part process. One is getting ready, and then the actual pre-IND meeting and what comes next. So before I go off and really go in details on the pre-IND, I do want to acknowledge that some sponsors, companies that are filing the IND, actually need earlier advice from FDA, and that is typically through what's called an interact meeting. All of the FDA meetings are called PDUFA meetings based on the legislation that defines their timelines and constraints. And interact is a PDUFA meeting that comes before a pre-IND and focuses on a very limited topic that really is a stopper for going forward with the development that the client perhaps sponsor, or if it's being worked on with the consultant, focus on a topic that is really limiting your continued development. So for example, of an interact topic, you have a lack of target effect in rodents. And so you would like to get FDA's agreement to conduct toxicity testing only in non-rodent species. So that would be an example. And passing that hurdle with the interact meeting, then the pre-IND meeting follows. And that is your first chance to share with FDA your development status, your target indication, data that you have to that point. For example, CMC, non-clinical, your clinical plans, or your actual clinical data if you started your program ex-US. Now, the tools to optimize a PDUFA FDA meeting include templates. I can't say enough good things about templates. Requesting a meeting and then submitting the briefing document are structured based on FDA's guidance for industry, which is entitled Formal Meetings Between the FDA and Sponsors or Applicants of PDUFA Products. Now, beyond the project details, I want to emphasize that this first pre-IND meeting, and you only get one, is in fact the scope of plans from your first impression being established with FDA. It's kind of like your speed dating with FDA. And they are looking at you and saying, as a sponsor, are you transparent in what you're describing? Do you seem naive to FDA? Do you offer constructive negotiations? And importantly, and Mark's going to speak to this, are you a good listener? Now, unlike the European Scientific Advice Meeting document, FDA meetings are done typically in 2 steps with the process, and there are some exceptions. My Interact is an example of where the meeting request and the briefing document are concurrent. But step 1 is a meeting request when you're having a pre-IND meeting. Now, the FDA reviews primarily any high level in the meeting request and specifically your questions to decide if there's merit in having the meeting. It's not guaranteed, guys. FDA does not use, however, the meeting request to answer your questions. This is a really important distinction. FDA uses the briefing document, which does relist the questions, and that's how FDA then decides on your answers. Now, a few words about the structure of the meeting request and briefing document and those questions. Unlike the European request for scientific advice, where there's typically a applicant's position, the question, and then supportive data around that question, each FDA question is introduced by only 1 to 3 paragraphs for context. Remember, this is not the answer part. This is just deciding if the meeting is justified. These data then are given in the briefing document, and that is where FDA starts to make their answer strategy. It's important that you organize and realize that FDA's meeting, the flow in a briefing document is by discipline, C&C, non-clinical, clinical, and each question then in the briefing document will be linked to an appropriate data section. And in this way, the briefing document has all the technical data in one place. That's a distinction between the European that puts technical data in association with each question. So for example, in C&C, the technical section goes from drug substance, then drug product, and for non-clinical, it progresses from data that you summarize because you've done the studies versus plans, perhaps, and the studies that you are proposing. So assuming you are getting the meeting, and I do want to clarify, FDA may choose not to give you a meeting in the form of face-to-face, video, or telecon. They may choose to give what is called a written response only, which means they granted you the meeting, but they're not meeting with you. They're just writing you answers. But after the briefing document is submitted and you're waiting to hear what FDA's answers are going to be, the question becomes then, what do you do as a team? I like to suggest doing a blue sky exercise where you actually turn the team around. They're the experts. They've advocated for their position, but now you're going to say, no, you're all FDA. What could FDA not agree to in what we've just proposed to them and justified based on the data in the briefing document? It's really an interesting exercise to put the team in a defensive mode to justify and find more answers. And I always enjoy looking to see how many guesses we got for the FDA's point of view. So in the next slide, you will see, maybe, what I like to say the pre-IND meeting is really the path to not going on clinical hold. That's kind of like your worst case outcome. But shame on you if you waste any FDA meeting, especially the pre-IND, because remember I said you only get one. So what are examples of wasting an FDA meeting? First and obvious is going too soon. You don't have sufficient data, yet you're asking FDA to comment and give you guidance. So going too soon is a mistake. Shopping around across health authorities for advice to get what you really want to hear. Now, I'm not saying don't go and have multiple FDA and other competent authority meetings, but recognize FDA will not care what another competent authority says. They're not going to yield to somebody else. Another example is not revealing the data or asking the questions so that you can then just say to other investors or other colleagues, well, FDA was just fine with it, when really FDA didn't get the whole story, so they're not fine with it. The attitude of who needs FDA's input, we know what's correct, will only get you in trouble. And actually FDA's advice then will be negatively impacted. If you get an FDA answer of this will be a review issue, it probably means you didn't give them enough data and it's not a win. If you get an answer that says it seems reasonable what you're proposing, but this will be a review issue, there are still risks. So don't raise the victory flag too high. Some examples of reasons for hold can be if you only focus your meeting on clinical and not at your pre-IND, the whole gamma of data that you have, especially CMC. CMC can put you on clinical hold if it's insufficient. Insufficient data to justify a dose, for example, or if there's accumulation or a risk of concomitant drugs and drug-drug interaction are potentially issues that could snag you. And as a worst case, if you don't address them through the pre-IND and you don't therefore address them in your protocol, you may have a problem. Study design considerations like endpoint are especially important, as well as the proposed population you're going to study, both age, gender, etc. And actually, you want to make sure that what you're proposing seems credible to FDA. Mark, it's going to be to you to elaborate now on this.
Thanks, Sandy. I'd like to say thanks for all the people participating and listening in on this webinar today. We hope you get at least some useful information out of it. We've done our best to make it that way, and hopefully you will benefit. So these are what I've learned through many years of important tips for successful FDA meetings. And when you think about it, a lot of them are very much common sense. The first one, and I think sometimes the most important one, and Sandy has already stressed this, is to listen to the FDA. You know, let them finish their thoughts, because too many times I've seen people anticipate what they thought FDA was going to say, and then they cut them off mid-sentence to offer a differing opinion, only to find out later that they chose the wrong, made the wrong assumption as to what the FDA individual was actually going to say. So listening is really the key. And be courteous as well. I mean, again, this is more, you know, you would like you would like to behave with your friends or your family. Be courteous to each other. Don't interrupt. And that kind of goes back to the first one. Let, you know, the other person talking complete their thought, so that you don't, you know, go down the wrong path and actually, you know, waste time during a meeting that's limited to 60 minutes. Pay attention to body language, and this is more useful during a face-to-face meeting with the FDA, and they're finally starting to have face-to-face meetings again, but not for everyone, and pre-INDs are seldom face-to-face anymore. However, it's kind of nice when you're sitting in the same room to pay attention to people rolling their eyes or shaking their head in a negative way, whether it's on your side or on the FDA's side. That's stuff, you know, you should you know, keep it to yourself. You know, you can do that, do whatever you want to inside your head, but don't express it visually so that people see that you're either bored or you're disagreeing with the speaker or whatever. You know, keep it to yourself. Be prepared and rehearse. You know, I like to do usually 3 meetings before a pre-IND, and the first one is kind of a brainstorming session where you're trying to guess what the FDA might have issues with when you send them your briefing document. Then the second one is really more of a rehearsal. You kind of do the play FDA role thing. And then the third one comes after you get preliminary comments from FDA, and I know Sandy will talk more about that later, so I won't spend any time on that one. And then finally, don't be afraid to challenge the FDA. They are always up for a good scientific collegial argument if you don't agree with something, some comment they've made, or if you have an alternate view that you want to express to get their input on, and hopefully get, you know, maybe come to some kind of resolution if you're not both aligned, and by the end of the meeting, hopefully that will be accomplished. So the timelines, this is a little more detail. Sandy kind of touched on this, but So basically, the day you submit your meeting request to the FDA, that's day 0. And then by day 21, they send you a letter that says, yes, we've granted your meeting and it's going to be a face-to-face meeting on this date, and we need your briefing document by this date, 30 days prior to the scheduled meeting. And then on day 30 is when you send in your briefing book, which has all of the scientific information that you feel is needed to help FDA be able to answer the questions that you have posed to them. Then 30 days after that, so on day 60, you actually have the pre-IND meeting, which can be, face-to-face or a written response or a teleconference. I've had all of those along the way at various times. I think the written response is probably easier for all parties because there's no rehearsing. FDA can just, combine all their internal responses and send them to you. You do have the option to get a clarification post WRO if you receive one. And then on day 90, FDA will issue the official minutes, which recount any agreements that were made in the actual meeting itself. And up until then, you just have preliminary comments. So my rule of thumb, I guess, for lack of a better term, is that for biological products, and I'm talking really about recombinant proteins here, I like to recommend having a pre-IND meeting 1 year prior to submitting your IND. Because a lot of times, especially with recombinant products, there may only be one tox species that's applicable, and that would be non-human primates. So you want to make sure that you do the right study with FDA input, because otherwise you may wind up having to repeat a study that can cost you $1 million or more to run and take 6 to 9 months, 12 usually by the time you get all the data from it. So a year is a reasonable time to actually have that meeting. And one of the things that should be discussed there is the design of your definitive toxicology study. For a typical drug product, a small molecule, there's been established list of non-clinical toxicology and safety studies that should be conducted prior to a first-in-human trial. And it's pretty standard. It hasn't changed much since the late 80s. I think it was originally issued by the National Cancer Institute, and it described the 10 or 15, however many tests there are that you should do, various, single dose, multiple dose, short duration, long duration, and so on and so forth. And in a case like that, you can wait until 6 months prior to IND before you have that pre-IND meeting, mainly because the tests you have to run are pretty well defined. For cell and gene therapy or ATMPs, again, the traditional non-clinical tox studies don't often apply because of species specificity that you find. Some years ago, I was working for a small company, and they were developing a product that was manufactured using CD34 cells isolated from umbilical cord blood, human, of course. And they needed to do some non-clinical work in a rodent species. They wound up having to collect umbilical cord blood from mice, isolating the mouse CD34s, and only then could they actually run that non-clinical study. So it's a bit complex, and it's hard to find good models for cell and gene therapies, especially gene therapies. And in this case, I also recommend 6 months prior to IND. So the meeting request that you put together for pre-IND is very well defined in this particular guidance for industry cited here. It was last updated in September of 2023. The meeting, like we said a couple times now, can either be a teleconference or a face-to-face meeting or a written response. And occasionally FDA will decline giving you a meeting at all because they don't feel you have sufficient data to support a meaningful discussion. So that's always an option. Doesn't happen often, but it does happen. So one thing that we've learned, and I think Sandy would support this one, is that you should not submit your meeting request until you have the briefing document at least 80 to 90% or more complete, because things change, and you don't want to wait until you send the meeting request to start on the briefing document. You want to have it be almost ready. I've had a couple of instances in the past where FDA did something different with the meeting date, And then they asked for the briefing book 2 weeks earlier than we would have normally planned to send it. So you got to be kind of prepared for that outcome. That's, again, not an often occurrence, but it does happen from time to time. So it's good to be very prepared and very on top of preparation of your briefing document in case that does happen. So the briefing document if you read the guidance document, I think they recommend 30 to 50 pages in length. In reality, it's pretty hard to cover all these items, the various sections of the briefing book in 30 to 50 pages. So I think a more reasonable one, and FDA is accepting of this because I've done it any number of times, 50 to 100 pages is still a fairly reasonable length. That's okay with them. And basically in here, you're giving them a detailed study status of where you are with your CMC development, what you've done non-clinically and what you're planning to do non-clinically, and any clinical data that you have to support the proposed indication, if you have any. Oftentimes companies don't. And then the focus becomes on ideally a fully developed protocol for their first clinical study, or a very well-developed synopsis. 2-page synopses don't work for FDA. They will come back and say, well, you really didn't give us anything to give us any idea of what you're doing in your clinical trial. So come back when you have something that we can actually, sink our teeth into. And this is submitted, like we said, 30 days prior to the actual meeting. So content of the briefing document is, again, is very important, obviously. You want to describe very detailed description of the CMC information you have. They're going to want to know details on how you manufacture the drug substance and the drug product, how you test it, what your preliminary specifications are, and they can be quite wide. They know you're just starting. These things evolve over time, and they expect you to tighten the specifications as you get more manufacturing data to support changing them, and they will allow you some leeway on the initial clinical trial. A lot of times they also want to see stability data, characterization data. They want to know what your methods are. Any viral clearance studies that you may have done, especially for recombinant products that are mammalian cell derived, like Chinese hamster ovary cells being your source initially. And they will ask you to do a viral clearance study to support that you can show a 3-log reduction in 3 or 4 model viruses through your purification process. Non-clinical, I always recommend that you should summarize whatever clinical study, non-clinical studies you have already done in a nice table where you show species, numbers of animals, brief description of outcome, and then also include a table of the additional non-clinical studies that you plan to do yet. And there's some that you can do after you submit the IND, that's okay. And there's some that you have to do before that they will expect to see in the IND. So this gets confirmation from FDA that you're doing it properly and that they're okay with that. Another one that's helpful, again, for cell and gene therapy products is a biodistribution study. It's very difficult to do what we would consider a classical definitive toxicology study with cell and gene therapies. So what FDA likes to see in a case like that is a biodistribution study in a species where you can actually see that and include some toxicology endpoints in that study. Clinical data, you're going to want to provide the rationale for why you think your drug has a role in treatment of the disease or condition that you plan to study. That will also be based on you showing in the non-clinical data that your drug has the potential to affect that endpoint or the disease that you're going for. They want to see what your general investigational plan is for essentially the first year after you file the IND. Any previous human experience, if you have it, should be summarized in the briefing document. And then, like I said before, either a protocol or a well-developed synopsis for your first in-human trial.
And if you're going for that robust synopsis, heads up, make sure you have a stats section, because one of the things that FDA criticizes is they'll see endpoints and they'll see inclusion and exclusion in your robust synopsis, but they have no idea of your statistical approach. So if you're trying for a synopsis, my recommendation is you don't leave out a stats section.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So a few strategic points here. On the CMC side, you should have a pretty good idea of what your development plan is going to be for how you're going to manufacture and test your product. FDA expects everybody to start at a small scale, and they know that you're going to have to scale up as time goes on. So because you'll go from small clinical trials to larger ones. Ultimately, you want to commercialize and you want to be able to supply the market however big that may be. So it's good to have a good idea of what you have in your mind. You don't have to give them a super detailed description of what you're going to do, but you should let them know, that you actually have this in mind, you know where you're going to go next and what kind of changes you're likely going to have to make. That can change based on circumstances. As you manufacture, you'll learn things, and that can result in changes to your manufacturing process. But you just want to let them know that you understand these changes are coming. You'll tighten specifications as time goes by and all of that. So it's good to somehow reflect that in your briefing book that you have these plans. On the non-clinical side, you want to select the appropriate tox species to conduct your studies in, if that's applicable. You want to have an idea of your first in human dose, because they're going to want to know what is the safety margin that you have between a no effect level in your toxicology studies and your first in human dose. Any ADME PK information you have, pharmacokinetics, biodistribution for cell and gene therapy products. You should either have a plan for that, and you can get confirmation from FDA at the pre-IND meeting, and then conduct the study so that it will appear in your IND when it comes time to submit it. On the clinical side, obviously previous human experience, but you also want to give them an idea of, like let's say it's for an extremely rare disease, life-threatening disease. You may want to let them know that you're contemplating at least that you're going to do a phase 1/2 to initiate your clinical trials. And if all goes well with that, your next step would be like a registration quality phase 2 study. Again, cell and gene therapies, this is not unusual to see this happen. And so you want to let them know that's where you're going, because then they'll see that you are trying to go down an accelerated pathway. If you're developing another non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, it's pretty much a cookbook thing. You'll do phase 1, then you'll do phase 2, then you'll do phase 3, then you'll file your NDA, and it'll be based on 5,000 patients. But for the more cutting edge products for serious life-threatening rare diseases, they know you're going to be in a hurry to go to get started and to proceed towards getting approval. Okay, Sandy, back to you.
All righty, thanks, Mark. So we've done a lot of conversation around the idea of the briefing document, well, the meeting request, and then importantly, the briefing document. So FDA has the briefing document. Now we're going to flip onto their side of the story. What happens? Well, about 1 week prior to the actual meeting, assuming you're not getting written response only, FDA will have an internal meeting, finalize the preliminary written response, and they will actually be preparing to send that to you. In that time frame, how many days before the meeting they send you the preliminary written response is a function of the type of FDA meeting it is. For the pre-IND, it can be it can be as bad as, should I say, no later than 2 days before the meeting. And FDA always, when they send you the preliminary written responses, they also put in their letter to confirm, the sponsor, confirm that you still need the meeting. I can't off the top of my head think of any time a sponsor who got a meeting said, oh no, that's okay, we're done. They always want to have another follow-up conversation. So in that time frame from you get the preliminary written response, you will have 2 days to do a lot of stuff. It's very stressful. First thing you're going to have to do is review all of FDA's answers and decide if there are some questions that they've answered that really need no further discussion. It's kind of like what I say, once you get the sale, stop talking. So if you're good enough with their answer, don't keep talking about it. Then the next issue is to go through the remaining questions and put them in order of priority. As of this last guidance that Mark put up and I referred to before, you can only have 10 questions. And of those 10 questions, if you do 2A and 2B, that counts as 2 questions. So 10 questions is the max. And once you put them in order, then you, well, first decide that you need to discuss them and then put them in order. Why is that? Because if you only have 1 hour and you run out of time, the thing you want left on the table to do follow-up with are your lowest priority topics. The next thing is to make sure you have, for each question that you're going to discuss, you need a primary and a backup speaker for each. The scope of the company's position should then be summarized, and I always recommend putting it on a slide. Now, this could be already having anticipated something FDA said. Remember the blue sky example? So you may have a jump on these, or you may be de novo starting because they really surprised you with their answer. The key in each case is that the 2 speakers are going to sound like they're speaking. Reality is they're not free flow speaking, that it's scripted to avoid making extra statements in the stress of the meeting. Ideally, regulatory will have led the agreement, negotiated with the project manager to use these slides. More recently, sometimes FDA has asked for you to submit to them prior to the meeting, if you're having it, to give them an agenda and essentially summarize. I still like to see, for these non-face-to-face meetings where you're not going down to the FDA, I like to have slides. And the reason is because the slides then can be displayed and the team can use them to stay on target and keep to the agreed position. All of that takes place in 2 days. Now, as a last comment, and you can see it's the last green bullet here, day 90. FDA will issue minutes 30 days after the meeting. That's considered the official minutes for the meeting. However, you can submit, and I recommend 2 days, not 2 days, 20 days before that, after the meeting, 2 weeks after the meeting, I recommend that you submit sponsors. So FDA is going to have 4 weeks, you take 2 weeks, and you give them FDA sponsors minutes. That's especially important if there are topics that you may not have aligned on what you heard. It could be the case that there are some people at the meeting that heard it one way and some that had, wishful hearing on and heard it another. The sponsors minutes are a great opportunity to get the clarification. They will not become part of the official minutes, but you can submit them and ask FDA to please address a specific topic noted in the sponsors minutes. So that is a tool that you could use as well. And
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra and Mark, for your insights regarding the preparation and successful conducting of pre-IND meeting. And before we move to the next section, which will talk about the IND authoring, we'd like to ask you another question. So which aspects of IND preparation do you find more challenging? Thank you for your responses. Well, it's very well equilibrated responses. So in this next section, Sandra and Mark will provide you their insights based on their experience, how to build a successful IND dossier, and to share their tips and pitfalls.
Thanks, Leland. So let's move to the actual IND. I think we've talked about the pre-IND meeting and what you can do to be optimizing it. But now we're going to move on to the actual IND. Let's make the assumption you've had the pre-IND meeting and you do have optimized your plans. The form, it's a regulatory form 1571, is, in my opinion, a great tool. And it's noted on this slide. It's a tool for you to allow to make sure you have all the pieces. Now, Mark's going to go over this in way more detail, but a few clarifying points I'd like to make. First, for an IND, you need a signed protocol, not a draft, but a signed protocol. If you have at least one investigator that has signed the FDA form 1572, now that's not the 1571, it's a 1572, and provided his CV or her CV, you should be in good shape. You need one investigator to open the IND. Now, let me make a point. In the US, we have what's called the USPI. It's the label of an approved product. And that's what a physician treating patients use when treating with a marketed product. However, the treating investigator in your study, they use what's called an investigator brochure. The IB becomes essentially the label for the drug and helps the investigator know what are the risks as they look at individual patients that might have side effects. Is this related to your product? Has it been reported? The IND also has included what's called an informed consent form, an ICF. It is written in very simple language because it is written for the subject, who, a patient who is in your trial. And it tells, in essence, what is going to happen in the trial. It emphasizes the trial is research, and there may be no benefits that that person will receive. The subject has free will, and by that I mean they can quit with no consequences if they discontinue the trial. That may be the case if they're experiencing a lot of side effects. It could be as simple as going to the clinical site. They didn't appreciate how inconvenient it was going to be for that many site visits. But from their point of view, it's important that they understand that if they do decide to discontinue, and this is in the ICF, there will be no consequences, negative consequences to them. So if their primary care physician, their treating physician, in fact, is the investigator even, no punishment, no ramifications. Also, the ICF confirms that the patient's identity will remain confidential. So these are high-level comments about the IND, and now Mark's going to dig more deeply into some of the technical sections. Mark, you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so again, we've touched on this earlier, and this is just an elaboration of what was included in the briefing document for the pre-IND meeting. Only here, it's much more detailed on both the drug substance manufacturer, so they want to know the characteristics of your product, who manufactures it. Do you do it yourself, or do you have a CDMO making it for you? And so method of manufacture, acceptable limits, analytical methods that you're using for either in-process controls or release of the final product, stability of the drug substance for use during non-clinical and clinical studies. There's various names for this. I'm sure you've heard many of them: API, BDS, NME, and other more complex names like have been used for cell and gene therapy products. They also want to see the same information as we just described there for the drug product. Qualitative and quantitative composition, stability data, at least 30 days in the initial IND to show that you're ahead of where you are in the clinic, so that, when you dose the first patient, you will already have at least 30 days worth of stability, showing that it's okay through that length of time. And then your program continues out to 24, 36, or more, 48 months, depending on where you're going towards, what you want to do for your commercial product for expiration dating. And then if you have a placebo, again, it's just like the drug product section, only it's for the placebo, which doesn't have active material in it. And they often expect you to perform an assay on the placebo to demonstrate that it does not contain the active ingredient. So data required, more data required in the IND itself. The non-clinical data, so a summary of all the pharm tox studies that you've done, pharmacology, toxicology, safety, any pharmacokinetic and metabolism work that you've done, depending again on the product type. And these should all be in reports that are included in your IND and summarized in the early, where your questions are. The data should be presented there. And again, it's very helpful to include a table showing which non-clinical studies you've conducted thus far and what the results were, as well as another table showing the ones you still have planned. A lot of times that's like, again, depending on the drug, if it's a small molecule, you're probably going to have to do a carcinogenicity study. So you want to tell FDA and the IND that you're going to do the in vitro version of that, and that you will do the rat study as opposed to proof of commitment. That doesn't necessarily have to be decided in the IND, but it's good to let FDA know. On the clinical side of things, like Sandy described, there's an IB, there's a protocol, ICF, and then the 1572 form. One other thing that you should mention here too is that, if your first in human study is a safety PK study in normal volunteers, then you're not required to submit it to clinicaltrials.gov. However, if it's a phase 1/2 with efficacy endpoints or any other trial through phase 3, you must submit it to clinicaltrials.gov so that it's publicly available. And in your IND, you have to include what's called a Form 3674, which is a commitment from the sponsor saying that when data from this study is available, we will publish it on the clinicaltrials.gov site. And it's usually you have like 12 months after completion of the study to submit it to them. But it's something you don't want to forget. Again, if it's a phase 1 in healthy volunteers, no need to worry about that. But when you get to the first study that has any hint of efficacy data being collected, then you have to include that form in your IND as well as the 1571. Yeah, I think that's it. Yes. Oh no, I'm sorry. One more. So ultimately, you know, the process consists of authoring, reviewing, usually 2 cycles, compile your IND, publish it, do a final QC, both hyperlinks within the document as well as the data itself that's presented there, whether it's non-clinical or clinical, or even CMC, you'll want reviewed by QA. You should initiate authoring of the IND at least 6 months prior to the submission date. It's possible to do it in less. I've certainly had circumstances where we did it in as little as 3 months, but it's not really a fun experience when you have to do it that quickly. Sometimes it's just how it is, but 6 months is a comfortable amount of time for an IND. It involves all your disciplines within your company. So manufacturing, non-clinical, clinical, publishing, QC, QA is involved. Regulatory strategy is a part of it. You need to have an amazing project manager to keep track of everything because there are lots of moving parts here. And for, like, there's usually, in my experience, you usually have a lead regulatory strategy person, and then you have a project manager who's very good, and you work in tandem to make the IND come together. And it's nice because one person literally can't manage all of that by themselves and do a stellar job of it. So it's best to have 2 individuals in those 2 roles. As you can complete sections on a rolling basis, and you should, just because it kind of relieves stress to the people who come after you, whether it be people reviewing it or your publishing group. They like to get things like if you know all the references that you're going to include in the IND on day 1, we should get those from you, and they should go to the publishing group who can, you know, compile them in a place where they're going to build the IND ultimately. The last document, when we do publishing at BCLS, as well as all the other things that we've discussed here, the publishers insist on having the very last, and I mean singular, document in their hands by 2 weeks before the submission date, because, you know, there's hyperlinking within sections, but there's also hyperlinking between sections. They can only do that once the entire IND has been built in their publishing software. So they need at least 2 weeks at the end to make sure it all comes together the right way. Like I said, if done well, this whole process can be accomplished in 6 months. Possible to do it in less, but not ideal necessarily. So one of my philosophies, and my colleagues at BCLS also, I think, subscribe to this, is that one of our goals, especially being a consulting organization, is that we're going to help you as the sponsors minimize, probably never eliminate, but minimize the occurrence of any questions that the FDA will come up with during their 30-day review of your IND, because those will come back to you as information requests, and you usually have minimal amount of time to respond to them. So sometimes that means you may be putting more information in your IND than what individuals prefer to do. I've certainly been criticized for that in my past. But to me, if it heads off even a single question that could wind up as an IR or potentially a clinical hold issue, it's worth doing. So that's my words of wisdom on that topic. Thank you.
So now we're going to get ready to talk about a little bit more about the submission review that Mark has just touched on. But I want to make a couple of points for you as distinction with the US IND. Unlike the European CTA, the IND, and actually even the pre-IND submission, must be done electronically using the electronic common technical document format. So that is a point of distinction. If you're a little company, you don't typically have the infrastructure to do that kind of electronic publishing. So in addition to all your other concerns and planning, you need to find a vendor who can do the publishing for you. Some vendors just do publishing while others, for example, like BCLS, do publishing, and they can do just publishing, and as well as offer much more support for you. For example, if you're an ex-US company without a US facility, then you will also need to provide FDA a contact person called a US agent. And this is a role I've played many, many times for clients. And so if you choose the right support consulting group that gives you more bandwidth if you're looking to do more than just publishing, but to have things like a US agent. Once you've submitted your IND, FDA, as you probably realize at this point, has 30 days to review it and make their decision. And as Mark mentioned, if necessary, they will ask for additional information because they're trying to get to a decision. Clinical hold, good to go. And if it's in that 30-day window, they are going to give you very limited time because they don't want to miss their 30-day clock. That is part of their PDUFA obligation to the FDA Congress. So with that, let's now chat about some FDA actions after the filing. A few points. At the end of the 30 days, assuming FDA is satisfied with the benefit risks that they've assessed based on your data in the IND goes into effect. And for semantics sake, an IND is not approved. They will give you a study may proceed letter, and the IND is considered effective. The FDA doesn't give you an approval letter, so that's important, but it does with the study may proceed letter allow you to ship investigational drug to the investigative sites. Remember, it's effective, it's not approved. But in the study may proceed letter, now you're not on hold, you've got the letter to proceed, you may still get additional data requests. These are non-hold, but they need to be addressed in a timely fashion. So you need to put them on your radar and have a plan to address them. FDA may, at the time of IND being effective with the sponsor, identify deficiencies that therefore need more data and more information. You may go back to FDA and ask for advice in the form of guidance meetings, advice meetings, they're called type C, or it can be an end of phase, like an end of phase 1 meeting, an end of phase 2 meeting is very important. FDA may, on the other hand, impose a clinical hold even after a study has been initiated. So you do need to be aware that that could happen. Examples of why would be that human subjects become, in FDA's opinion, exposed to unreasonable or significant risk. This may, in fact, show up from your data of ongoing safety reports, and Mark's going to talk about safety reports in a moment. A clinical investigator may not be, in their mind, qualified. Now, typically, if that be the case, where you've opened the IND with an initial investigator, but you've augmented it and made amendments for more investigators, if FDA finds somebody they don't consider qualified based on the review of the CV primarily, at that point, they'll put typically not the whole study on hold, but that site on hold. So you do need to be cognizant of the importance of choosing your investigators. Another example can be the IB is misleading or gives erroneous or incomplete data. And remember, the IB is the label. So if the IB doesn't really meet the qualifications of a label, then they could put you on hold in the middle of everything. So be careful that you keep your IB up to date and it is comprehensive. FDA is always looking to confirm and continue to prevent risks to human subjects. That's their thing. And so as development continues, you are expected to submit IND information amendments. For example, a new tox study gets issued. You are expected to make that submission to the IND so FDA can keep up with those new data. Insufficient CMC or non-clinical data may be something that FDA considers as development continues and you provide more information. A lack of safety monitoring is another example, although I don't typically consider that to be a concern for an IND. But I want to bring out something. You could end up having an interaction with FDA, a very critical concern about safety, not based on your drug. If your drug is a drug of class and there's another product that is having a safety issue, FDA may actually request additional information from you. Now, as an advocate of FDA, I do want to say that their ongoing risk to benefit is really focused on what's their obligation, and that's to protect the safety of subjects in trials at the IND stage. Post-approval, they're still protecting in a post-marketing way the safety. But in this case, you must realize FDA is, they're not like shareholders of your competitors. They are there for the patients. And as I've always said to my students, if FDA asks for one more safety analysis, think about it as if they didn't and the drug was being exposed to your wife or your child or yourself. I used to say your mother-in-law. That didn't resonate for people, so I'll stick to the other three examples. You really do want to be careful and not overlook FDA's intention. And now Mark's going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that are in relation to IRs.
Thanks, Sandy. So, like Sandy said, I mean, basically, once a sponsor has responded to all the information requests satisfactorily to FDA, and there's any other pending issues are resolved, then enrollment may commence, and FDA will send you a study may proceed letter. So then you're all set to start your first in human trial in the clinic and proceed from there. So lifecycle management of an IND. As you can see, we're in the red box here on the far right now, and there are a number of things that are responsibilities that sponsors have to abide by. And one of those is there's any number of amendments you do to an IND, and the first of those, and usually the most critical, well, I won't say the most critical, but one of the more important ones is protocol amendments. And these can be either new protocols for a new study that you're going to run under the IND, or they could be amendments to an existing protocol where you've added a new efficacy endpoint, or FDA wants you to collect blood samples at a different time point, or you're increasing the patient number in the trial, and so on and so forth. There's also information amendments for any new non-clinical data. One thing you should keep in mind is that if you conduct a toxicology study, once you get the final report from the CRO who conducted the study for you, you need to submit it to the IND within 30 days, and you should update your investigator brochure at the same time. Because if it's safety data, FDA wants to know, and they want investigators and patients to know about it as soon as possible. So this would also wind up having an impact on the informed consent form. Any chemistry, manufacturing, and control changes, you need to submit in an amendment unless they're very, very minor. And then other technical information about your product. Annual reports are also a requirement. In Europe, it has gone to development safety update reports as a requirement. FDA hasn't gotten there yet, but they happily accept the DSURs just because the safety data is so much more well developed in a DSUR than it is in your typical IND annual report. So most of my clients at this point, even the US clients, submit DSURs. What you find out is that the aspects that were usually addressed in an IND annual report are now like an appendix to the DSUR. So all the same information is there. It's just sort of in a slightly different format, and obviously a lot more safety data. And that the annual report is due within 60 days of the anniversary date that the IND went into effect. It covers the previous 12-month reporting period with, usually you establish a cutoff date that's a couple of months before the due date, and that 12-month period ending at the cutoff date is what you cover in your annual report. As development continues, obviously you have more opportunities to get FDA feedback at various stages during the development process, into phase 1, into phase 2, and then a number of other ones also.
Before you go on, I just want to make a couple of comments about the DSUR. DSURs are typically generated when a company has ex-US studies, because as Mark mentioned, the DSUR is the format used for Europe. typically, you inform FDA of your intention to switch from an IND annual report to a DSUR. And what typically happens is you may need to generate a bridging report because the IND effective, which sets the 60-day due date for the IND annual report, doesn't necessarily align with the cutoff that was used for the DSUR, which is based on the international development birth date. So you often have to do a bridging to get the two dates to align. After that, you go forward. So you may want to keep that on your radar as well if you are entertaining switching to the DSUR, which both Mark and I are recommending, because then you only are using one window of time and you don't run the risk of overlapping and double reporting the same patient's data in two different forums, and it gets double counted. So it is definitely something I think strategically we both advocate, but there is a little bit of caveat to how to implement it. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, good point. And finally, one thing that is very critical, and you will encounter somewhere in your development program in the clinic, and these are IND safety reports. So these are serious adverse drug experiences that occur in patients in the trial that may or may not be related to your product, but they do occur in the trial, and FDA expects you to report them. And the 5 key ones here are death, a life-threatening adverse drug experience, hospitalization or prolonged hospitalization if they're already in the hospital for the study, a persistent or significant disability or incapacity, and finally a congenital or anomaly or birth defect. I've actually never seen an IND safety report that was specific to that last item, but apparently FDA thinks that they need to know that if it does happen, and I suppose it could. So it's important, other important medical events. Sometimes you do safety reports if you saw something untoward in a non-clinical toxicology study that may indicate a safety issue for humans. So these are reported in the US on a MedWatch. That's a form 3500A, that's FDA's form. In Europe, this would be reported on a CIOMS form. And there are 2 types of reporting. There's a 15-day report, which is for, there's a slight distinction here that the FDA makes, and it's the one is more serious than the other. I mean, they're all serious, right? So the 15-day report is for serious and expected, I'm sorry, any adverse experience associated with the use of the drug that is both serious and unexpected, but this can also be for non-clinical events. And then there's the 7-day report, which is unexpected, fatal, or life-threatening experiences associated with the use of the drug. One key piece of information here is that wherever it's reported, whether it's US or Europe, whichever form you use, MedWatch or CIOMS, the investigator conducting the trial determines causality. So is it unrelated to drug? Is it possibly related to drug? Is it probably related to drug? I think there's 2 or 3 other ones in there that I don't recall off the top of my head. And his assessment stands. The FDA will not let the sponsor change the investigator's assessment because it's, the investigator is the one that witnessed the AE, not the sponsor, because the sponsor is not even on site. So that's an important fact. Sponsors, when they report the adverse events on these forms, they can, state their own opinion on causality. That's usually the big one, and that's for the record. However, the investigator's determination of causality is the determining factor that FDA will look at.
Before we go off of the safety report, let me just add, FDA does accept the CIOMS form. It doesn't go the other way with the FDA's form, but in most cases, I think the more recent CROs conducting studies typically that are doing pharmacovigilance reporting use the CIOMS form. The one thing you need to make sure of in that CIOMS form is that there is an analysis of similar events. I have seen CROs that forget to do that, and that is an important piece of data that FDA appreciates. So the good news is, this is our last slide, takeaway messages. And I think first off, I want you to understand and appreciate, as I say here, animal data buys you the right to human exposure. That's the whole non-clinical data package that is used by FDA and actually by other competent authorities to anticipate what the safety risks may be. And that's one reason why it is so important that you update that as you continue development, your non-clinical data. Second takeaway is my point about before. FDA is responsible for protection of safety of trial participants, and that is an ongoing assessment. It's the life cycle, IND life cycle management discussion that Mark touched upon, and the obligation to keep updating your IND with new data. IB is the label. I made that point, and I can't overstate how important it is that your IB is correct and accurate and up to date. Transparency with the FDA is strategically wise. They're not your enemy, and in fact, the better relationship you have with them from pre-IND forward, you will find that the advice that they give you is better in most all cases. The use of the right regulatory consultant, and I guess this could be misconstrued as a commercial, and I don't mean that to be the case, but there is something to be said for having regulatory consultings. In addition to the CRO that's conducting and monitoring the study and doing central pharmacovigilance, there is something to be said for a regulatory consultant. This is in addition to the fact that they have experience by virtue of their clients, many FDA divisions and types of products. It is important also, and this is a hidden benefit, outside of the extra pair of hands when the going gets rough and the time is crunched, they also can offer what I will call a minimization of conflict between stakeholders in your company. Ironically, stakeholders, as you move forward, start to come forward and identify themselves. There are people that believe data interpreted one way or another. And so it diffuses some of the stress, if there is any, between people who see the data one way versus another, because your regulatory consultant can actually jump in there and add a little bit of balance into the interpretation of data or the strategy for going forward. So if that's a commercial, I'm sorry, but I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Sandra, for this summary and these key takeaway messages. We have last questions for you, which is: do you plan to submit IND in 6 months, 12 months? Well, thank you for responding. Some of you have still time to take benefit of our experts, Sandra and Mark's insights, the preparation of IND dossier. We have time for some questions. The first one that I can see on the chat is, when a sponsor wants to start a second clinical trial, is it necessary to submit a new IND?
So let me jump on that. The answer is, if the second trial is continued under the same IND indication, then you do not need a second IND. And that's different than Europe, where each protocol gets its own CTA. So the answer to that would be no, unless you're changing indication, in which case for the same product, you could have multiple INDs. So that I think is an important distinction in your thinking. And if you're submitting that second protocol to the same IND under the same indication, there is not a 30-day review. So once you're up and running, after the initial 30 days, then your subsequent protocols can go without review. That doesn't mean FDA may not come back and ask questions, but in theory, you are allowed to get it started.
Thank you. I have another question. What options can you recommend if FDA input is needed before a project meets the Interact meeting criteria?
I can go ahead and take that one. Well, I mean, there's a few options. I mean, there's the Interact meeting that you could take advantage of. Or you can do, there's also a type D meeting that's very, very focused, narrowly focused, like 3 to 5 questions in a single discipline, like just non-clinical or only CMC kind of questions. Something that I've done, not recently, but in my past, was working on a recombinant protein some years ago. We weren't ready for a pre-IND meeting. We really wanted to get feedback from the FDA farm tox reviewer on our study, our definitive tox study that we were going to do in monkeys. And so I got in touch with her. We had a good relationship. I got in touch with her, sent her the protocol, said, Mercedes, could you please let us know if you have any criticisms, changes, whatever that we should make to this. And at least at that point in time, FDA was, I think, more willing to do that than they are now. So you almost need to go to one of the more structured meetings. Interact is probably the best option. Again, very focused, usually no clinical questions, usually just non-clinical and CMC. And they won't answer if you ask for them to give you comments on a protocol for a tox study, they'll say, sorry, we're not your consultant. You can propose a species and we will comment on that, but we will not review your protocol and tell you if it's acceptable or not in the interact setting. That's a pre-IND kind of a question.
But you know, so two things. The type D tends to be more of a follow-up question after you've had a meeting, at least was in the current paradigm, most recent guidance. But you do have the option, even before a pre-IND, of doing a type C. It does, as Mark mentioned, you have to get kind of a little bit of preliminary discussion within the division. But presuming you have not even had a pre-IND, a type C advice type meeting would be an option that you could go forward with even before the pre-IND. I recently did that.
Thank you, Sandra and Mark. Last question. What are some of the ways an IND and CTA for the same clinical trial differ?
So outside of the IND is structured from an ECTD point of view using, module 3 for CMC, for example, instead of an IMPD. The number of source documents that you have to submit in an IND is, their source documents, your tox study full reports, which is different than the full scope of a CTA. I think one of the big differences is if you have done non-clinical tox studies, you will, if you have tox studies that have started after December 17th, 2017, those reports will also require send data sets, which are not part of the CTA. And in fact, the same distinction of things that are called CDISC atom type electronic databases of your clinical. So if you started and done a phase 1 and a phase 2 outside of the US, you will be under obligation to potentially submitting those data sets as well. There's a really big difference, and because I'm as old as dirt, I can tell you back in the day, FDA would have, Europe would use the expert reports, and European reviewers would go top down. Sometimes they wouldn't even need to go beyond the expert's report. FDA has always gone in the weeds. They go data up. They love to do an analysis of your data all over again to see if they come to the same place you did. So I think philosophically, that's a key difference. The electronic submission is a key difference. Mark, am I missing anything?
No, I think you got it covered, Sandy, actually.
Thank you. And maybe we can go for a last question. For an ATMP, is it useful to send a full IMPD as part of the submitted package for a pre-IND meeting?
I can handle that. For a pre-IND meeting, you don't need a full IMPD. FDA probably won't read it.
Right.
So what you need to do is a summarization in the IND. Now, if something we do for clients frequently is they'll already have a study going in Europe and they'll ask us to convert the IMPD to module 3 for use in a new IND. But you don't need it at the time of the pre-IND meeting. You just need a reasonable summary of, like, let's say, I don't know, it's arbitrary, but let's say 20 or 30 pages maximum in your briefing document on CMC aspects of your product. So obviously you don't want to put the whole IMPD in there. It would be, FDA has limited time to review these things, and they're not going to spend time going through an entire IMPD prior to a pre-IND meeting.
In fact, you don't even, for a pre-IND, normally you don't even give them the IB. It is exercise in being disciplined in the appropriate data at the appropriate level of detail to anticipate what FDA will need to reach their decision and give you the answer to your question. If you approach it as, what do I need? Because I've only got a limited time, you will be a better writer of your briefing document.
Thank you. Well, I think we can thank Mark and Sandra for the presentation, very insightful presentation, and thank the audience for your attendance. And I remind that the webinar will be available on the VSTLS website. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.